Cool. So shall we be punctual if you guys all ready? Thanks so much for being here. It's an honor to be amongst you all here. Feel free. I hope that the talk will hopefully last for like, I don't know, 20-25 minutes and gives us some time for some chat and some Q&A, and interesting to hear sort of insights and thoughts, and where any of these things strike home with you. I couldn't start but mention, hold on, there we go, that I feel very much like the Padawan amongst Jedis here amongst this course. So many of my teachers and masters are here even with us. So a lot of what I'm sharing here is a bit of having worked alongside Dave and Sonia, but also work from Jennifer Garvey-Berger, and also some other people that I've had the privilege to meet. So kind of it's an entanglement in and of itself to be here. So I'd just like to point out, and I'm really honored to be here and grateful for all the, a lot of these ideas, of course, not mine. It's more of how I see them sort of meshing together. So hold on, let me move this to the side. So with that much said, kind of like, well, what are we doing here? What is this this moment? This keep calm, it's not business as usual. And the world, and we sort of moved from the 90s, from the VUCA, now the Bunny, and now Della, and this whole idea of working business. And it's not that one replaces, it seems to add on. The VUCA is now VUCA and Bunny, and now VUCA, Bunny, and Della. So this whole idea of this ever-changing landscape, which seems to be accelerating, and this level of complexity seems to be sort of dumping and downpouring on top of us with ever-creating rate. And I came, the thought of this talk coming from, I recently joined Itaú, which I don't know if any of you know, it's one of the largest banks here in Latin America. And we call ourselves Itubers from Itaú. And there's approximately 95,000 employees in the bank, which, if you use Max Boisseau's math, that gives us, about 4.5 billion possible links just between us. And we have 60 million clients. So if you think about the quintillions of possible perspectives within the organization, but also, if we consider the perspectives of our clients as well, the math and the number and the complexity is just phenomenal. And having, the bank is just almost turning 100 years old. It's 98 this year. And to think about the fact that it started from a very engineering, it was a family of engineers that, built the bank, started it 100 years ago. And that culture of an engineering, of looking at things and how they can be sort of broken up into smaller parts and reassembled and made more efficient, has worked very well until now, until more recently, where the complexities, of the internet and network speeds and industry 4.0 and so far have made, and the onset of social networking and how our clients interact with banking and so on and so forth, have made us need to do things in a different way. So when you think about what we're talking about, like, this is the typical idea of efficiency and agility. Everything's nicely ordered, but of course life is not like this. This comes from an artist called Ursus, which I think is really cool. And life is like this. It's messy, it's spontaneous, it emerges. This kind of playground setup is not how it is. This is how life really is and how play really happens. So this is, what has brought us to this moment. And I don't know if you guys have been following the news recently, but this is a picture from last Sunday here in Brasilia, where a mass of 4,000 people stormed our capital and sort of invaded and ransacked and destroyed through the most important sort of government buildings in the country. And we can't understand it. Where is it coming from? We couldn't predict it. It was unpredictable. But the results, looking back in hindsight, of course, you can connect the dots, but looking forward is so difficult. So part of the thoughts here, and I imagine many of you may be well versed with complexity and Kinevin and so far, and that's kind of the school where I'm coming from. But I think it's really important to bring in this idea of the differences now between what is entangled complexity and emergent to what is very highly complicated. And here there's not a judgment call about which is better or worse, or that, everything that is complicated is like old school and we should own everything now. The world should be looked at through this single complex lens. But it's actually understanding that both are present, and there are values in understanding the difference between the two. So Sonia had this great piece that she wrote a couple of years ago about the 7 differences between complex and complicated. So I've brought it here, and it's been an inspiration working in the bank and also noticing the subtle differences. So just remembering that with cause and effect, that you know, in a complicated system, you can see the effect. And here, you know, if you pull out one piece, you can see it fall, and you can repeat this 100 times, and you can understand that the cause effect has an effect. You can monitor and copy it. But in the complex systems, things are emergent and they're non-linear, and you can't understand cause and effect. You know, the parts and the agents and what's influencing the system are usually beyond our scope, and there are too many points, a bit like going back to the billions and quintillions of links. We simply can't see all the effects that are happening, you know. And also this linearity, that things that what's linear in a complicated system, again, you can see when, you know, the inputs and outputs of a system are proportional. While as, you know, in a complex system, using the metaphor of the butterfly's wings, you know, a very small, sometimes we see it daily, a single tweet can have a massive effect. A post on the internet can make massive changes. The smallest of changes can have massive outcomes, and sometimes, you know, huge. Let's do a massive rollout, a new culture scheme in a large organization, sometimes just doesn't take off and just withers away. So the understanding of these 2 differences and where they're applied makes a huge difference. You know, the idea of the sum of parts. In a complicated system, you can take things apart and rebuild them again, take them apart and rebuild them. They can be very, very complicated, you know, building of a Boeing 747 or, you know, a large Airbus plane, but they can be dismantled and reassembled and put back together, and they'll work. So some of the parts can be understood and reassembled. But here, this picture of a client of ours here in Brazil, to understand, we can't take her apart, and we can't take apart, you know, a whole culture of how people interact with their banking or how they interact with each other. You know, the sum of the parts can't be understood. We can't dissect it and rebuild it, you know, but we can understand its disposition, right? Again, with control and solution, this whole idea of what can we fix, you know, how can we monitor the KPIs and so forth. We want to, you know, like in a complicated system, they're highly appropriate. And in the bank where I'm working, of course, there are hundreds of systems monitoring thousands and thousands of different interactions. And that's great. You know, it's great to know that when you make a payment, the payment is made and you get a receipt, and that's all fine. But when you get to a point of understanding the interactions between people and between agents, and here the example of the, you know, the stock exchange is a really cool example of a highly complex system where, you know, we can all interact. If we all choose together to go out and buy a certain stock, we will affect the price of that stock, and in return, of course, affect the stock exchanges around the world to a greater or lesser degree. And it's unpredictable. Some people are better at understanding and viewing the patterns, but even those most experienced will never say it's 100% guarantee that they can't repeat. If they had a successful purchase or made you know, a bet into the future and it paid off, they can't repeat that again. Looking back in hindsight, you can see you made a good decision, but of course, in the real moment, in the decision-making moment, you can't, right? You know, constraints, whoever saw Sonia's talk early on was really cool. She talked about a lot about constraints and thinking about in the complicated systems of, you know, mostly the parts of the system are designed to do certain functions. You know, the interact, you know, this cockpit, there are all these different buttons. Each button has a certain role, has a certain objective, what it does and doesn't do. While as in a complex, you know, looking at traffic, for instance, as an example, everything is interactive. It's what creates traffic, when. Every day the traffic is slightly different. You know, I live in Sao Paulo here in Brazil, which is traffic is just insane. We have millions of cars and millions of people on motorcycles, pedestrians, bicycles, torrential rains now in the summer. All these affect the traffic, and no single day do we get the same amount of traffic in the same different places, right? Knowledge is a really cool idea, and remember, those of you who know the history of Cynefin, it began with David knowledge management and understanding what can be known and what is unknown, what's the unknowable. And you know, in a complicated system, you can take things apart. You can become an experienced mechanic as a system, and you can understand every single part, what it does, what it doesn't do, fix them, change them, and become a master. While as in a complex system, you can become quite good at the system, but every walk, it's about getting involved. Every walk, every hike within the complex system is slightly different. There are so many parts of the system that the knowledge is by walking. You can't pre-read. You can read a whole bunch about a certain trek or a walk through a forest, but the actual walk will be different to the books or the reviews or the videos or the photographs you saw previously. It will be different, and the knowledge you'll gain from that will be different, and you can't repeat it. Yeah. Creativity and adaptation as a final difference is really cool, because in a complicated system, you have to put energy into the system to create change, to create this, to create a step forward. While as in a complex system, especially in an anthro complex, whether a human is involved, you don't necessarily have to put energy in. The system evolves, it adapts. And again, taking judgment aside, not necessarily always for the better, but it does change, it does adapt. And here this image of, the jazz players, the street players that play and riff off each other. They didn't necessarily decide. They may have chosen a first or second song, but when it starts, when it ends, how they play, if they repeat, how they feed off the response from the audience that are watching them. All of this leads to, and maybe the next day they don't play as well for all these different reasons, so these 7 differences are really cool, and we've used them a lot here in the bank to try and separate what is complicated from what is complex, and how we look at that in the types of leadership decisions we make and how we manage our teams. And understanding that complex problems need to be more surfed than solved. Here we use, we have even a department that's called, that's specialized in problem solving. Then the thorn that goes in and say, well, not all problems can be solved. So we've now got this split of looking at problem surfing and problem solving. For those that are in the order domain that are complicated, they can be solved. We can call in an expert and get them solved. But with a problem with complex ones, we have to learn to kind of write it out. We have to walk it, we have to jam with it and understand the system and understand the disposition of the system to make changes. So we go away, we take a step away from following the recipes, a step away from reading the books on the 7 tips of being a great leader, or the 10 commandments of good management principles, and become more like chefs. It's great to have the experience, to have management experience. They're an amazing set of leaders here at the bank. But we have to move away from following necessarily understand that what are the enabling constraints within leadership and management, but we have to be allowed to improvise, and based on context, what kind of thing are we going to do? And next, to add to this entanglement, well, fair enough, I've understood the difference between complex and complicated, but understanding that on an individual basis, there are mind traps, and here taking from Jennifer Garvey-Berger's work, it's really cool to understand the mental traps. Because here it's great to talk about it, and we can, to hear and discuss what are the main characteristics and how we can observe complex adaptive systems, but understand that our own minds are a problem. Our individual minds are a problem from the way we think, the way we've evolved, but also the way our educational system has been built. So we love a simple story, and it's blinding, but we love a simple story. And therefore, when we think of the story, when we hear of our teams that come, we've got this problem, how can we solve it? Many of them come with the problem actually with a sort of a coded over solution. Or we think this is it, this is the problem. Oh, we've got a leadership issue here. The manager here is not good at giving us direction. So it's always like, well, what other stories are there? And who else? Does everyone tell that story? We have to interview and talk to the actual leadership and maybe the other departments that are working around that leader, and understanding this value of ambiguity and diversity. Like, I don't really know. And that story seems odd. So we'll kind of park it. Let's see if there are other ones. So how do we understand and make the story actually help the story become more complex? So we bring in a bit of, avoiding just the extremes of the white and the black, bring in the tones of gray. Secondly, this seeking alignment. Everyone, the number of meetings we get called, let's have an alignment meeting so that everyone's on the same page, and it's all, we're all sort of on the same beat. But this kind of drives away ideas, it drives away novelty. And it also it doesn't help people deal with the fact of discomfort, like, I don't really agree, so it actually stifles the level of involvement within teams that we have. If everyone's on the same note and everyone goes away thinking, this is what we have to do, the newcomers to teams and those with different opinions, be them naive, be them creative, be them outside the box, are kind of repressed. So how do we make it possible for us to kind of bring in these ideas? And even some of these ideas, they're not ready, they're not ripe, they're just seedlings of ideas. And how do we nourish them? Because we don't know whether the seedling will become, a wonderful hardwood tree, or whether it will bring fruits or benefits of different kind. So how do we nurture these different ideas? And of course, alignment avoids this. However, things in a complicated domain, alignment's great. It brings efficiency, it brings standardization, it brings quality control. So understanding where these mind traps are and the context within what we're looking at makes a big difference. This is a classic. Just because it feels right doesn't mean it's right. Who's the next guru? Just because someone's doing something great in Amazon or Google doesn't necessarily mean it'll work with us. Even if it makes coherent sense, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll work. So the things you need to think about is, what if I'm wrong? And play devil's advocate a bit, and to be able to be a bit more playful especially in the design process, and think of scenarios. Well, what would happen if, and what else could be true? Is this the only answer, or are there possible scenarios where different answers could be appropriate? Finally, trying to take control takes away one's influence. Control is no guarantee of success. If you think about the documentaries that we've seen of Chernobyl or other disasters, where this idea of I've got this dashboard, I'm actually quite distant, and this is of a nuclear reactor. This image of a control room. You're very distant from the actual reactor for obvious reasons, but of course this sense of, well, I'm trusting these lights, I'm trusting these buttons, I'm trusting these gauges, and I'm making an informed decision. But sometimes we have to understand that the control is not the best thing. So it's also, when understanding we're in a complex domain, is what can we enable? Less move away from this desire to control and control outputs, and thinking about, well, how can I enable outcome? So this is this slight difference and this mind trap, and also understanding that I'm an agent within the system, especially from a leadership role. What enables me or what constrains me, and therefore this idea of what we actually control is really interesting. And also, of course, this self-image, holding on to the way we think, that this is how I perceive the world, and therefore it's right. There's a whole bunch of science that says that we, a good 90% of reality we miss, second by second. It's just gone. I don't know what's happening a couple of meters away from me here. And, I don't know how many people are listening, paying attention, falling asleep, but still, so this attachment that we have to our own sense of understanding and viewing the world is very important. So this idea of what can I be next, and what of how the world's going to see me, but thinking of my own personal evolution in terms of my career, in terms of my understanding of the world, is something to be kept in mind. So entangled agility, what does this mean? I kind of think that perhaps this term I may have coined, but I'm not sure, that this idea of agility is so aligned with efficiency, and sort of this idea of swim lanes and really straight lines, so we get to the point. When I think of complexity in Praxis, it's almost like, how can we intentionally wrap ourselves around? And nature is a wonderful teacher in this, and we see this in how trees support themselves, our own muscle fibers, they're all kind of interlinked. If you think about our brains and these amazing processing units that we have inside our heads, are not all straight lined and efficient. They're all entangled, and they connect in different ways and stuff. So in an organizational context, I believe that there are 3 levels of transformation that demand this entanglement. So this self-descriptive awareness, and Dave mentions this a lot, is but it's also, I think, on 3 levels. So we've got this, how do we become more descriptive of ourselves as agents in the system? So I become more aware of my own impact in the system. I become more aware, and I can describe better how my teams are interacting with each other, but also how I'm interacting with larger systems. So, the HR system or the payment system or all these different systems we have within an organization. How do they interact? So looking at this 3-tier approach and trying to, how do I make these things entangle in a way that I create efficiency and resilience intentionally, and it's not just a mess, but there's a sort of biological beauty, a bit like a DNA strand. There's a lot of information there, but it's all kind of twisted together. So when I think of entangled agility and what we're trying to do at the bank as an example is, how do we become resilient? How do we become innovative? How do we connect, and how do we transform? In a way that makes sense, in a way that's adaptive, in a way that it's entangled. So we probe and experiment. We do a lot of testing with ourselves, but also with ourselves within our smaller departments, with other departments, and of course, how we entangle and how we probe with our clients. But of course, understanding we do this when we understand the system is complex. And we try and observe how the things flow, and it's an effort to look at how things flow between. So it's not the actual things, it's not the actual agents, but how are people interacting? So there's a bit of rhizomic learning there, and that's a cool term. It's a bit like, how do we connect, and how the nutrients spread amongst ourselves in the organization, and in terms of ideas, in terms of thoughts, in terms of actually how we interact, even though we're still in a hierarchical system. How do we connect? And again, Dave talks a lot about entangled trios and social network stimulation, stuff like that. So how can we do things in a slightly different way that create the conditions for this entangled agility? So we encourage social networks, and we try and design for emergence. So when we run a workshop, how can we bring in different people, different thoughts, different agents, different ideas? How do we kind of decompose and recombine things? So we've got methods that come from the agile framework, but we also got traditional SWOT analysis, and we bring in data, real hardcore objective, but we also bring in NPS data. We also bring in people's perceptions, and we also collect narratives and stories from our clients, but also from our employees. This idea of scaffolding for transformation. So we kind of like, how do we build this kind of a scaffolding that's rigid enough to hold things, but it doesn't get in the way of itself? So this idea of building towards a journey, towards this sort of constant motion and constant transformation and evolution. So when we look back, we've actually moved forward, we've progressed in terms of the products and services we supply, but also as a team, also the quality of people's experiences in the workplace. So with this, sense making and context intelligence are becoming transformational skills. We have to train people, like, how do you read context? What is making sense? Be it the traditional 5 schools of sense making or otherwise, but at least getting people into understanding that they have to do that pause and understand what's happening in their context. So to wrap up, because I'm interested to hear what you guys have to think about this, just a few drivers that are driving us in terms of this entangled agility is, how can we connect and transform the actual workplaces? So we create this space for this emergence, so that it cultivates a new way of doing things. We're actually doing the same things, but doing it in a different way, trying different things out and seeing what works best for us and our customers. Also, can we do this entanglement consciously and purposefully? Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes if we take a wrong turn, we have to go back and do things differently. Sometimes we create discomfort and inflammation in the system. The system has its own kind of antibodies to a certain degree, right? So the system pushes back. We have to take a step back and do things in a different way. So we have to connect to the relevant nodes. And it's so easy to write this, but so hard to find what are the relative nodes? What are the important and relevant nodes within the system? Who do I connect to? Who knows who to connect to? So there's also this understanding and knowledge of the who and the when and the what. And also, once within the system, how do we also do this with our customers, suppliers, and even competitors, right? And finally, you know, how can we become agents in this journey to something more evolved, to sort of get more sophisticated and even more entangled, so that we interact, and hopefully by this interaction we kind of mimic, you know, biomimicry that we create a better sense of balance in our own system and our own personal lives. We become less stressed out, less burned out, and sort of reduce our own levels of anxiety that we perceive in the system. And of course, the systems will benefit from this. The planet and, you know, the world hopefully becomes a notch closer to being a slightly better place. And I think large organizations like the one I'm in now, and I imagine most of the large and small, of course, play a huge role in shifting how the planet will do, because people spend just so many hours of their lives in these spaces. It seems appropriate that this is the places that can sort of become Trojan horses, in a good sense of the metaphor, in helping create change and helping create something different. So that's it. I've kind of skimmed through it fast because I want to enjoy the discussion. I want to hear what you guys have to say. And so let's sort of surfs up. Let's surf these topics together. There's a QR code to my LinkedIn. It'd be great to connect to all of you afterwards. But I'm curious to hear thoughts on Entangled Agility and what came up. I haven't managed to follow the chats, but I'd love to hear from you what you guys have to say. Let me stop sharing.
Hey, Ian, thanks for doing this. I had a question. Yeah, at your bank, this Entangled Agility or concepts like this, are you trying to propagate that to everybody, every employee in your organization, or who do you focus on within the organization to help this happen?
That's a really good question. We have, out of the 97,000, there are about 20,000 that are active in Agile-based tribes. I think we use the word community, but it's sort of tribes. So we've chosen to go there first, and very, very gently bringing this in, because we got a lot of sort of the Agile coaches, Agile experts, and the rest of it. And there seems to be there's a lot of connection to understanding this, sort of the mindset is very appropriate to understanding, you know, this whole idea of, you know, discovery and a backlog, which is very sort of in the complex domain, and then bringing that into the complicated. So we're starting with those, but we have open courses, so we have people from all over the bank, but that's kind of the focus, is to start with the Agile folks, just because they kind of have that rhythm in terms of looking at things. So it's a little bit of we kind of see them as the low-hanging fruit. But the idea is it to become, you know, hopefully, you know, spread around the whole bank as possible. But that may take a few years. Cool. Anybody else?
Ian?
Sure.
Sorry, did I jump in on someone?
No, you didn't, Ray. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yeah, thanks for that. You've got a sort of a nice microcosm to work within now since you joined the bank. And I'm sure you haven't perhaps thought a lot about this, but, and I don't want to use the word measure because I don't think that's the right word, but I might have to, because I can't think of a better word. But how are you thinking about monitoring performance? Someone's paying you. When will they decide that you're doing a good job, or have they bought in? You know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get at.
I think
this stuff's hard to measure, right? At a organizational level, your job sort of depends on some success. What is that success? What are you watching for?
Yeah, well, that's a really good story, good question, Ray. Basically, the transformation office, we focus on 3 pillars. So we're looking at how people behave. So we're trying to monitor and capture how people behave in terms of And that brings in all the issues of, the ethics of that. But like, how are people reacting to being transformative agents within a system for a system? Like, how is their ability and their openness to help things change within the bank, but also for our customers? Then we have organizational agility, which is looking at how things flow. So basically looking like, how can we reduce bureaucracy? So it's like lead times and the number of complaints we get in sort of our in our official lines, how many complaints arrive at the central bank, and so on and so forth. So we monitor all of those, and we actually call it the aquifer. So it's kind of under we can't see it, but we have all these different indicators that we're monitoring to be able to see where the systems and where the different departments, and there's just huge numbers of sensors all spread all over the place. So we're going and sort of borrowing people's data and putting it together and sort of training that into heat maps. And of course, then there's the last pillar, which is business. So looking at actually like how we're helping the businesses, make more money and deliver better products and increase the NPS scores of the products and services the banks supply. So we kind of have a lot of ordered data. And on top of that, we've just started the SenseMaker process, which is the tool that the Kinevin company supply, which is great for monitoring, the subjective and the complex and the unknown. And hopefully we'll get dispositional maps. So we'll have heat maps of how people are experiencing their day-to-day. We'll be able to understand to a greater degree how people are experiencing their day-to-day lives. And then over time, be able to hopefully, like you say, Ray, show the boss, look, since we started working on this, things have moved from an egocentric looking after my own to a more ethnocentric, concerned about the client, concerned about my impact on other departments. We can see this shift moving, and we believe that's a more healthy shift. It's good for business, it's good for the client, it gives us more resilience. So it's a slow process of building this tool that will hopefully give us heat maps to understand a bit of the radar. Again, it's a map, it's not the actual land. But hopefully we'll get a system that that we can look at it and say, well, we seem to be moving in the right direction. We seem to be creating more balance in this kind of way we were going. But again, it is subjective, and it takes a while to change the mindset of people used to just a dashboard. Like, is it 5% or 6%? There's a lot of people who like the numbers in the bank. And we're also talking about, well, this is dispositionality and how this is moving here, and it seems to be a trend. But we understand that it's an upskilling and understanding of how to read a complex system as well. I don't know if that's a bit of a roundabout story to tell you, but that's kind of how we're doing it. Any more? I had a look at some of the questions. Do we have any questions in the chat? Whenever you're ready.
I had one more, not to hog up the airwaves here.
Please do.
But this is really interesting to me. Are there maybe common business practices or maybe practices at your bank that get in the way of this, that kind of cut against the grain, that you're most concerned about or that you have to deal with most often?
I think one of the hardest shifts, and this is, imagine for anyone who works in a large organization, is this shift from moving. There's so many departments. Everything's so big with the bank that it's just like this massive sort of tanker. So there's a time, things take time. But I see this shift as we're moving from, instead of looking at outputs, we're looking at outcomes. So instead of looking at just like, how many credit cards we issued or how do we generate valuable experiences? How do we generate? So that shift takes time, but I believe it's a shift that is of a more expanded awareness, but it's so much easier and so much nicer just to say, just tell me what to do. You want me to sell 1 million credit cards? Fine, get my team, we're going to sell it. We're going to find a way to issue 1 million credit cards. And it's different than to say, well, can you create a better credit card experience? Well, it's just much more intangible. But therefore, the understanding of context, the understanding of complexity seems to tie in really nicely. So it seems to be this route of where a lot of companies are going. How do I create an amazing omni-channel client experience? seems to be driven by, I have to understand context, I have to understand a bit of applied complexity, I have to be able to understand that, especially in Brazil, if you think it's just, as a continental country, 250 million population, and just massively different cultures from north to south, from poverty levels to billionaires. And so how do we deal with that? So I think that's kind of the challenge, but I have a sense that we're moving in the right direction. Yeah. I hope that kind of answered your question, Andy. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Tanya's got something in the chat for you, Ian.
Oh, cool. When you first told me about the concept, you shared a wonderful story about a little bit about the in-between, this liminal space in between departments. Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks for that reminder, Sonia. It's really cool that we're also shifting at the bank this idea of, it used to be very department based. So there'd be like a director, and the director had 3 managers, and the managers had this, and they just looked after, I don't know, just like the smallest part, like the issuing of credit rating for leasing cars. It's like this whole team just does that. And they would be, they'd get their end of year bonuses based on how they did that. So that was like, and then of course, I had to focus on my end of year bonus, and you had to focus on yours. But if your request is to me, then that might get in the way of my bonus, So to give you a sense of scale, currently, at the end of the year, we had just under 50,000 different requests in between departments. So departments asking another department to do something to help them out, right? So 50,000 different requests. So how do you scale that, and how do you understand that? So this idea, tying into what Sonia was saying, is how do we find this space that we're between, that we actually got commonality between departments, that we actually, it's better if we do an and. It's not like either your idea or my idea, who's better, what's the priority, who says what's most important. Is how can we work in a way that we intentionally reshift and redo things in a different way, that we kind of get to do what you need and I need at the same time. And of course, this will take years to become really streamlined. But that's kind of the movement that we're doing at the bank now, is how do we intentionally do things differently? And some of the things is like, well, one director now, no one director answers to a single streamline. They're in charge of 2 or 3, and sometimes very different. So they're intentionally entangling their responsibilities, and the bonus structures are moving differently as well. It's more collective and less individual. So that's kind of where we're going. How do you convince bankers who specialize in financial planning, economic predictions, that it's not really possible? Well, it's not deterministic. Great question, Clark. I don't know. I think I'm really lucky to be with an amazing set. The new CEO is a really progressive guy, and he set up this amazing leadership team. And one of the core principles, we've just sort of coming out with this new culture. One of the core principles is, it's great to say, I don't know. Right. So more and more we see this idea that you don't need to have the answer. You need to have an answer to what you know about, but it's perfectly all right in any meeting to raise your hand and just say, can you go over that again? I must have missed the memo. It's not trying to avoid that, shaming and, oh, don't you know, didn't you read? So you don't have to turn up to all the meetings. You turn up to meetings where you deliver value. And I think that really, really helps with the leadership, is this weight off their shoulders. They don't have to know everything, so they don't need to make superficial decisions. They can say, give me a minute, I'm going to talk to my team. There are analysts and managers and people who know more about this subject than I do, even though I'm a director. So that's been really helpful. Have you seen people understand role, power, identity clearly, understood the complicated domain, make necessary changes to those things? Geez, that's
I can rephrase that if that's easy.
Yeah, sure.
It's easy for me to say it. Well, I mean, I can just imagine that, particularly in a bank, people are used to the hierarchical position, who makes the decisions, what the expectations are. Then with the same people, they've got to kind of interact with them and other stakeholders with a very different role and identity, and sort of should be a different power relationship with those people. So how do you see them sort of take off the hat where they need to maintain that position in one domain, but have a very different relationship with people in the complex domain?
Simon, what's really worked well is to create an experience where their hierarchy, their role is not important. They just have to show up with their understanding as human beings. So we create dynamics. So let's talk about certain issue, but we're going to mix up the teams, and the mix up there's a certain amount of design. So we got to make sure it's, we either put all the leaders together or we separate them in a different way, because it depends on the context. We spend a lot of time understanding the power dynamics before we suggest this kind of thing. But at the end of the day is, how do we design a cool play date in a sense that we kind of shift the system so the bullies aren't bullying, and but they get a new experience. So the bullies sometimes are with the newbies and they're a bit more gentle, and we just have we play around with the power dynamics, and we bring in topics that are less stressful. Sometimes we bring in scenarios that are just fictitious, and they just have this experience of that was really cool to work together. And we seem to resolve differences. We don't do the typical, let's do a team building exercise. It's more about how can we look at things differently? How can we appreciate the difference in perspectives? And some of the outcomes are, hey, that was kind of cool to do that differently, And I've never worked together with, some of the web workshops we do is like, well, let's just do it just with a high leadership, just, the superintendents and the directors. And usually we say, no, let's call in some, let's call in some freshmen. Let's call in some sort of people who have just joined, low down in the ranks, that are eager, and it's a way of actually giving them a bit of feedback that they're doing a good job, they're being recognized, and they get to have an experience that they're doing a workshop together with directors and stuff like that. And the directors think it's great because they get to see some of the new ideas coming into the bank, and it's a cool. So that's kind of how we kind of tweak the system. It's a bit malicious to a certain extent, but we do it with the best of intent. And the idea, and usually at the end of it, we see very positive energy. People are laughing, they're discussing, we have extended coffee breaks. We always bring in loads of sugar. We think that's kind of cool, lots of chocolate and chocolate cakes and stuff like that. So we kind of make it an appetizing and a cool experience. And hopefully people reconnect in different ways. And after that, we've heard feedback of meetings being run in a slightly different way and stuff like that. So that's kind of the approach that we've been taken, which is very, very oblique. To how it's done. It's not intentionally, it's not written on the wall what we're going to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. How are we for time? I've completely lost track. Have we got a few more minutes left? How long am I allowed to go on for? Any more questions? Adriana, you're from Brazil, aren't you, Adriana? You can ask a question.
No question.
No question, Adriana.
No, your presentation is ours.
Oh, cool.
Fantastic.
That's cool. That's great to hear. Cool. So love to connect to all of you guys on LinkedIn. Be really cool. Questions and anything like that it's more of a, like I said, it's an entangled and grateful for all the teachers and masters before me that kind of inspired these ideas. And we're also learning to enjoy the ride. It's not about the end. It's not about the end destination. It's more about how we run it. That seems to be more fun and more light, and the culture we're working in is very easygoing. Ironically, I think changed very much by the pandemic. Before I joined only a year ago, but they say before, people still used to come in suits and ties, and now, when we're now coming back to normal, everyone's still in their t-shirts and their sneakers and jeans. So you're talking to these big banking directors, and they're just, easygoing, normal human beings, which has been really, really interesting to be around people who are incredibly powerful, incredibly influential within the banking system, dealing in billions, but very down to earth and very, driven to do things differently. Understanding that if we don't do things differently, we'll be eaten alive by, the up and coming fintechs and stuff like that. So we understand that there's a competitive threat constantly there. Even though we're very big, we understand that because of our size, is also the threat of doing things in a way that doesn't help us long term. So it's been a great journey. Cool. I think with that, we're pretty good, I think, for time. So enjoy the rest of the show, you guys, and great seeing you, and connect on LinkedIn. Thanks once again for the opportunity to be here.
Very good. Thank you, Ian.
Ciao. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, guys.
Ciao, ciao.